What are the United States? What are the United States' policy objectives with respect to the Ukrainian war? And then secondly, what is the current state of affairs in connection with that war? And on that latter point, I'm gonna hopefully not bore you too much, but read to you some testimony that the Director of National Intelligence gave to Congress on Tuesday about the situation, which I thought was just packed full of interesting information and observations. So let me turn to the policy objectives first. I think at the highest level, we've got two policy objectives in a general sense that are somewhat in tension with each other, if not in conflict with each other. The one objective is that we want to help the Ukrainians to preserve their independence. I don't know whether we have a policy objective in terms of what boundary line should be or such, but I think at least at the start of the war, we may not have even expected we were going to be able to accomplish it, but to preserve an independent government in Ukraine and not have the government toppled and replaced by a puppet regime. And our other objective is to contain the war both geographically and militarily, not to see it expand geographically and not to see it escalate. And those two objectives can be in tension with one another because the things we do to try to preserve Ukrainian independence and deter Russian aggression will almost inevitably have the effect of creating a greater risk of expanding the war or escalating the war. Let me take the first objective. The preserving Ukrainian independence and deterring Russian aggression. With respect to preserving Ukrainian independence, remember the EU and the United States over the last almost 20 years, despite George W. Bush's flirtation with bringing Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, had pretty consciously made a decision not to expedite or not to rush bringing Ukraine into NATO. I think it's fair to say that NATO was generally sort of reluctant to take on the responsibility of defending the Ukraine, and secondly, perhaps of a view that Ukraine had not yet demonstrated the kind of government, economy, or lack of corruption that would justify bringing them into NATO. And the same was true of the EU. So we made a conscious decision not to commit ourselves to the defense of the Ukraine. And that, of course, was reflected at the very beginning of this war when the president said that we will not introduce troops into the Ukraine, a position I completely agree with. But there is an interest, there is a national interest. There's a lot of rhetoric about this war that I think is inflated. The proposition that the fate of democracy in the world turns on the outcome of this war is, to me, almost preposterous. And from most of the commentary I've read about it, most of the commentators, or at least a lot of the commentators, believe that it's inflated rhetoric, and it's dangerous rhetoric because it impacts the ability to resolve the conflict. And certainly the proposition that democracy in the United States is somehow at risk or might materially turn on the outcome of this war seems to me even more far-fetched. you might make an argument that democracy in Eastern Europe, such as it exists, and that's a big question mark, such as it exists, that democracy in Eastern Europe is somehow at stake in this war. But I think even that is, frankly, I think the leader of Hungary is a bigger threat to democracy in Eastern Europe than Vladimir Putin is. But the thing that is at risk is, and this was true before World War I as well, Europe, for the last 70 years or 75 years, has had a period of peace, with no nation attempting to invade or conquer the other. Now, there are a couple of footnotes to that, one of which is we actually bombed Serbia in an effort to try to change the boundaries of Yugoslavia to get Kosovo out of Yugoslavia. I mean, our direct aim wasn't to accomplish that necessarily, but it was to end what we thought was a genocide, and probably was a genocide. But generally, Europe has had an extended period of peace. The same thing existed before World War I. From 1850, the Congress of Vienna, after the defeat of Napoleon, until World War I, there was no major war in Europe. The continent was, at that time, uncharacteristically peaceful. A period of peace that it hadn't experienced again until this most recent period. But there were several episodes of countries committing aggression against other countries prior to the outbreak of World War I that started to break down that behavior, and started to, and the restraints that the countries had exercised started to break down. Now, there are historians who look back at that period and say that the great powers, the five major powers at that time, should have taken more aggressive action in punishing or resisting the aggression by smaller powers that they essentially tolerated. Some people have made the same criticism of the United States and Europe with respect to Russian aggression in Crimea, and more particularly, I think, in the Donbass. How true any of those criticisms are is subject to debate, both by historians and by current commentators. But it is a legitimate interest. I don't think the United States and Europe and the EU could have simply looked at the situation with the Russian invasion and said, well, this isn't our fight. We're not going to get involved. We're not going to do anything. I mean, I think you can make an argument that it might have been in our best interest to do that from a purely selfish point of view, but I don't think we could have preserved the peace of Europe, or at least tried to preserve the peace of Europe, by not responding. The hardest problem that we have with respect to this policy objective of deterring Russia is, what's the end game? What's the what counts as, I don't even want to use the word victory, because I don't think anything that comes out of this war is going to be good for anyone. I think this war is going to make us all worse off in ways that we can't even begin to imagine yet, but some ways that are obvious already. But what is a satisfactory resolution of this war? What would we count as a resolution that accomplishes the objective of deterring future aggression? And some people might say we've already accomplished it, that Putin made a huge miscalculation and that he is not likely to do it again and is not likely to have the capacity to do it again. Others may say that that he can't be permitted, the Russians can't be permitted to gain any ground in Ukraine beyond the ground that they already held before the February 24th invasion. And they already held, or at least largely controlled through the separatist groups in Ukraine, much of the Donbass before this invasion. Some people would say if we can just push them back to where they were and so they don't gain anything, that's sufficient. Other people say, oh no, we got to push them out of the Ukraine completely. And then still others say it won't be good enough just to push them out of the Ukraine. We need to bleed them and bleed their military badly enough, which probably means a protracted war, so that they will not in the foreseeable future ever again have the capacity to do this. Now, which of those resolutions would satisfy our policy goals? I'm at the end of, if we can just get them back to where it was on February 24th, because I frankly think that it is more important to end this war than it is to win this war by whatever definition you want to use for winning, for reasons I'll discuss later. But that's the big question on that side of the policy objective. We turn to the other in terms of containing the war geographically and not having it escalate. What are the risks that it might escalate? Well, the biggest risk is the risk of defeat. There's a logic to escalation. When a war begins, if neither side prevails quickly, each side, the logical next step for each side is to escalate the fight. Unless they're prepared to give up, unless one side is prepared to give up or compromise, the logic of escalation becomes pretty compelling. And on that point, this to me was a good thing. Joe Biden, right now, the logic of escalation largely rests more, the threat of escalation because of risk of defeat, I think largely rests more on the Russians, who are more at risk of being defeated, at least in comparison to their objectives in launching the invasion, than Ukraine or the Western powers are. And Joe Biden just this week was interviewed, and I can't remember now where he was being interviewed. And he said something, he said, and I won't get the words just right, but it was something along the lines of, Putin may have put himself in a box that he can't get out of. And interestingly, then said, I'm thinking about what I could do in that regard. In other words, to me, that's a good sign, is that we haven't given up on thinking about how can we, to the extent Putin's in a box and he has to escalate in order to get out of it, what could we do that would cut that process short? The other, to my mind, risks of escalation derive from an escalation in policy objectives. When this war started, I think it's fair to say that both U.S. intelligence and Russian intelligence thought the Russians were going to win a quick victory and replace the government Kiev with a puppet regime, and the whole thing would be over in 5 days. Well, that didn't happen. Suddenly, and because of that, our policy objectives were quite limited. It was to help the Ukrainians as much as we could, expecting that there wouldn't be much help we could provide because the war wouldn't last that long. And maybe what we could do is help to arm an insurgency that might fight a semi-guerrilla war against the puppet regime that Russia put in its place. But because of the success that the Ukrainians have had and the failures that the Russians have had, the possibility of other objectives has increased. It's now possible to start thinking about things that we didn't think were possible when the war started. And as we think about them, if we make those our objectives, we increase the risk of at least prolonging the war and the risk of expanding the war. So, for example, when Secretary Austin said that the United States policy was to not simply preserve Ukrainian independence, but to degrade the Russian military sufficiently that it couldn't do this again, that was a dramatic change in at least articulated U.S. policy that had tremendous ramifications for how quickly the war could be brought to a conclusion and on what terms. In fact, there's a conservative historian in the UK, Neil Ferguson, quite well regarded generally, who was arguing that the United States wants the war in Ukraine to go on for a considerable period of time, like the war in Afghanistan, on the theory that the Ukrainian war, like the Afghanistan war that the Soviets were involved in for 10 years, would so bleed Russia that Russia would no longer represent a threat even to its neighbors. You remember the Afghan war bled the Soviet Union so much that the Soviet Union, in part because of that war, but also in part because it was a corrupted civilization on the verge of collapse, the Soviet Union collapsed and dissolved. Another threat to the risk of escalation and expansion is an escalation of the threat that we articulate that Russia or the Russian success would represent. It's one thing to say, as the director of intelligence said, that the Russian invasion threatened the geopolitical balance that existed in Europe in terms of no country invading another country. It's one thing to say that that's the threat that we're responding to and we need to meet. It's a much different thing to say that this is a war between democracy and authoritarianism, and we must win, whatever that means, however winning is defined. Because if we don't, democracy is at risk, either internationally or domestically. And if you really believe that, then the risks that you would take, the resources you would commit, would be much greater if, in fact, democracy in the world or in the United States was turning in significant part on the outcome of the war in the Ukraine. And that kind of rhetoric has the effect of making it more difficult for the administration to reach a peace agreement. Because if the fate of democracy turns on the outcome of this war, then what kind of resolution do you need in order to preserve democracy? And how much risk are you willing to take in order to preserve democracy? I just think that, in fact, with the exception of the Western powers, and even they, I will say, when that rhetoric is used, the Europeans back away from it. I don't think they use that rhetoric, and I think they are critical of the administration when it uses that rhetoric. Indeed, I think the administration may have stopped using that rhetoric recently. the Europeans don't really believe it, but in the world on a whole, nobody else believes it. There was just an article I was reading in Foreign Affairs today about how the effort by the United States to define this as a war between authoritarianism and democracy is considered in most other nations as hypocrisy. In fact, the Chinese also believe, like Neil Ferguson, the historian I mentioned, that we want the war to continue because we want to bleed Russia through this war. I think the Indians also believe that's true of our policy. And when we make a statement and articulate a policy objective like we want to degrade the Russian military so they can't do it again, the Chinese and the Indians and the Russians say, exactly. You don't want this war to end. You want it to continue. And then the last thing, and the most difficult, is the demonization of the other side. And this is the most, to me, it's the part of the analysis I'm most conflicted on, because I think there is substantial evidence of war crimes being committed, at least by Russian troops in the Ukraine. And whether those Russian troops were acting, had just lost discipline, or whether they were actually being encouraged by their leaders and their commanders to do these things, is a point that I don't think we know the end of yet. Although the troops in Bucha that committed what appeared to be the worst, or at least the best demonstrated war crimes, best proven war crimes in terms of the evidence, were given awards by Putin for their heroic service in the Ukraine. Now the problem for us, I just finished reading this article. I didn't know all of this. There's an international criminal court that, pursuant to a treaty signed by most nations in the world, has jurisdiction over war crimes. So if, and in fact this is happening now, if Russian soldiers, some of whom have been captured and are now being charged with war crimes, are to be tried, it's before this court. The problem is, for us, we refuse to submit to the jurisdiction of this court. We signed the treaty, but then we refused, George W. refused to submit the treaty to Congress for ratification. And during the Trump administration, we made the argument that the International Criminal Court was a corrupt organization deserving of no respect whatsoever. And with respect to the war crimes that are being committed in the Ukraine now, our government, will not take a position that those crimes ought to be tried before the International Criminal Court. Jake Sullivan was just asked in the last 2 weeks about, you say there have been war crimes that have been committed by the Russians, where will they be tried? And he said, well, it's true that the practice has been to take these to the International Criminal Court, but we think there may be other forum or fora for the resolution of those charges, and wouldn't commit to it going to the International Criminal Court. I'll say also that, in the article I just read, our troops in both Afghanistan and Iraq committed war crimes like what the Russians did in Bucha, not to the same extent, but it happened. It happened when their comrades were killed and they didn't know who did it, and they took it out. There was one episode where the soldiers went into the house and dragged women and children and old people out of the houses and shot them. So, and those troops were never, they weren't charged with war crimes, that's for sure. And we refer to the conduct by our troops of that nature as tragic mistakes, not ever referring to them as war crimes. So I guess one thing I will say with respect to that issue is, if we're really serious about war crimes, then there's a lot we need to do besides just accusing Russia of it. I guess the last thing in terms of policy objective is what is the world going to look like after this war is over? Because we may be creating a world of a nuclear divide, with the West on one side, China, Russia, and any other non-Western power potentially on the other side. We are certainly pushing the Chinese and the Russians together, whereas our policy ought to be to try to separate them. I was listening to a part of a recent interview with Henry Kissinger, and he was making the point that in the Nixon administration, obviously one of their great accomplishments was to split China off from Russia. And he was lamenting the fact that that is now being reversed in a situation where China is perceived, as particularly by our intelligence agency, but also by the administration, China is perceived as the much greater threat to us. And we could talk about that for a long time as to how healthy an attitude that is to have. But China is perceived as a much greater threat to us than Russia, and that we ought to be trying to improve relations with Russia in order to split it off from China. But what is the world going to look like afterwards? Because it's probably going to be a more dangerous, more militarized world than what was before the war. And in terms of the status, I always take too long. This is testimony by Avril Haines, who's the director of national intelligence, a woman, was given this last Tuesday before Congress. Importantly, it was given after the Victory Day celebration in Russia, which actually had some de-escalation promises to it. A lot of people thought that Putin would escalate the rhetoric, might even escalate the war by announcing a mobilization of troops. And he didn't. He was relatively restrained. He was rational. Putin is not a madman. He made a tremendous miscalculation and he's a gangster and he's a murderer. But he's not a madman. He's not Hitler and he's not Joseph Stalin even. And remember, we fought a whole war with Joseph Stalin, who murdered more people than Hitler did. We got to be careful with the rhetoric that we throw around. But in any event, this is her testimony after that, the good developments on that Monday, or the lack of bad developments. She said, she talked about the Russian objectives in the Ukraine, and she said this: it is increasingly unlikely that the Russians will be able to establish control over both oblasts, in other words, the Donbass, and the buffered zone that they desire in the southern part of the Ukraine, to cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. In other words, to landlock Ukraine, which would be a devastating economic step devastating to Ukraine, that they desire in the coming weeks. But Putin most likely also judges that Russia has a greater ability and willingness to endure challenges than his adversaries. And he is probably counting on US and EU resolve to weaken as food shortages, inflation, and energy prices get worse. Well, let me go back to this point about willingness. Russia has much, much more at stake in the outcome of this war than we do. As gross a miscalculation as it was on Putin's part to launch the invasion, Russia has much more at stake. And for example, back in the 1990s, when Russia was struggling to try to exercise some influence over the Ukraine politically and economically, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who I think was Carter's national security advisor and one of the leading foreign policy analysts, stated, and I think it was believed by the foreign policy establishment, that without the Ukraine, Russia could never be a major power. Now, I think Putin believes that. But so when you talk about willingness, take the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had much more at stake than the Russians did. The Russians put missiles into Cuba, but they didn't need the missiles in Cuba, and their security was not materially enhanced by the missiles in Cuba. In fact, Khrushchev was thrown out 2 years later because the Russian leadership thought that was a gross miscalculation by Khrushchev to put the missiles in Cuba in the first place. They were there to try to protect Castro from being assassinated or from another Bay of Pigs invasion. Russia, the Soviet Union, had very little at stake in that conflict. We had much more at stake, although it surprised me to learn that Robert McNamara at the time thought we didn't have much at stake, that the threat of the missiles in Cuba was exaggerated. And what happened there is we had much more at stake. Russia didn't. The equation of the Russian willingness to retreat and resolve that conflict in a face-saving resolution was much greater than it will be here. On our side, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, John Kennedy was told there was a 25 to 50% chance that crisis would end up in a thermonuclear war. We were prepared to fight a thermonuclear war, or to risk fighting it, in order to get the missiles out of Cuba. Well, Russia has the same problem, especially now. If they lose this war, and the United States and the West continue to arm Ukraine, potentially even bringing Ukraine into NATO, I don't know, the Russians will have an armed camp in part of their former territory and right on their doorstep, as they already do with the other NATO nations that surround them now. Virtually their entire boundary is encircled by NATO nations. And if Finland and Sweden join NATO, Finland in particular, Russia will be, I think, completely surrounded, with the exception of the Ukraine, by NATO nations, so that any conflict between Russia and any of its bordering countries becomes World War III. And Putin has made the not illegitimate point that we shouldn't be in a position where any border conflict can turn into World War III. Now, there's ways to avoid that, which the administration offered to Putin before he invaded. The Biden administration appreciated Putin's security problems, and they offered to discuss those. They offered to make concessions with respect to where arms might be placed, which is the big concern. We have missiles in NATO countries that border Russia. Those missiles are part of our defensive ABM system. And we tell Russia, they're not aimed at you. You don't need to worry about them. They're aimed at Iran. We're trying to protect Europe from Iranian missiles. But the missiles could be redirected, and the Russians asked to inspect the sites to confirm for themselves that the missiles weren't aimed at them, and we refused to allow that. Well, in the lead up to the invasion, the administration offered to allow them to inspect those sites, and made a lot of steps to try to give the Russians assurances that NATO on their border was not the threat they perceived it to be. But it wasn't enough for Putin. But the point here is that it's going to be very difficult for Putin to acquiesce in a resolution that's a win for us, if by winning we mean Russia being forced out of the Ukraine completely, and Ukraine now becoming an armed power on their border. And Bill Burns, who's the CIA director, and who also, back in 2008, when George W. Bush, against the advice of all of his advisors and against the advice of all of his allies, caused NATO to state that Ukraine would be brought into NATO, even after Russia had told us it was a red line if we did that. Bill Burns sent a memo to Condoleezza Rice saying, if we make this statement, if we tell Putin that we're going to bring Ukraine into NATO, that will blow up everything. I mean, it won't blow it up immediately, but it's going to put us on a path to a war. And I feel good that Bill Burns is the guy that gave that advice, is one of the key advisors to President Biden. But it's going to be difficult for them to retreat. Now, here's the next thing she says. Moreover, after talking about how Putin is going to be willing, because he's got more at stake, to fight this war for a long period of time than we might be willing to do. She says, moreover, as Russia and Ukraine believe they can continue to make progress militarily, we do not see a viable negotiating path forward, at least in the short term. Well, I got to say, no one's articulated a viable negotiating path in the long term either. Now, those negotiations will, I hope to God they're going on privately. I hope they're going on secretly. I hope we're having communications with the Russians now that might, in Joe Biden's words, give him a way to get out of the box he's put himself in. But there's nothing particular. And she then goes on and says, the uncertain nature of the battle, which is developing into a war of attrition, combined with the reality that Putin faces a mismatch between his ambitions and Russia's current conventional military capabilities. In other words, his conventional military force is not adequate to accomplish what he set out as his objectives, likely means that the next few months could see us moving along a more unpredictable and potentially escalatory trajectory. Then she goes on and says, the current trend increases the likelihood. These statements are really carefully drafted. I mean, the intelligence agency doesn't say likelihood when they mean possibility. the current trend increases the likelihood that President Putin will turn to more drastic means, including imposing martial law, reorienting industrial production, or potentially escalatory military actions to free up the resources needed to achieve the objectives as the conflict drags on, or if he perceives Russia is losing in Ukraine. The most likely flashpoints for escalation in the coming weeks are around increasing Russian attempts to interdict Western security assistance, retaliation, and I'll pause here and say, I think she may be referring to potential cyber retaliation for Western economic sanctions and threats to the regime at home. And now here, this next sentence, and then we believe that Moscow continues to use nuclear rhetoric to deter the United States and the West from increasing lethal aid to Ukraine, and now catch this, and to respond to public comments from the US and NATO allies that suggest expanded Western goals in the conflict. Here is the CIA saying that Secretary Austin's comments about degrading Russian military is causing Putin to threaten nuclear war. If Putin perceives that the United States is ignoring his threats, he may try to signal to Washington the heightened danger of its support to Ukraine by authorizing another large nuclear exercise involving a major dispersal of mobile intercontinental missiles, heavy bombers, and strategic submarines. There's also some who have suggested that he may detonate a nuclear device over the ocean in order to demonstrate that nuclear capability. We otherwise continue to believe that President Putin would probably only authorize the use of nuclear weapons if he perceived an existential threat to the Russian state or regime. Now, here let me pause and say what you might not appreciate. Both the United States and Russia have, you might think it's our policy not to use nuclear weapons first in a war. That's wrong. Both we and Russia expressly reserve the right to use nuclear weapons before the other side, so the so-called first strike capacity. And in fact, Russia actually has a military doctrine that they refer to as escalate to de-escalate. And what they mean by that is we're going to escalate up to a nuclear threat in order to get everybody to back off and de-escalate. That's part of their war doctrines or strategic rationales. And the way the escalation would occur, I've heard a couple of commentary. The most likely escalation would be tactical nuclear weapons. I don't know if you know what tactical nuclear weapons are. Tactical nuclear weapons are weapons that have a shorter range in terms of delivery than strategic nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons are defined as a range of below 300 miles and a lower kiloton explosive force than strategic weapons. But some of the tactical nuclear weapons have greater explosive force than the bombs we dropped on Hiroshima. Now, with regard to tactical nuclear weapons, it used to be during the 80s, during the 50s, 60s, and 70s that we had a superiority in tactical nuclear weapons, and Russia was inferior to us on those weapons and on strategic weapons, because during that period, we perceived that the United States and NATO could not win a conventional war on the European continent because Russia had much greater troop strength and conventional forces than we did in Europe during that period. As a consequence, we adopted a first strike doctrine in order to deter a conventional war, because we knew we couldn't win the conventional war. So we were saying, we'll use nuclear weapons, including tactical nuclear weapons, in order to deter you, Russia, from launching a conventional war that you know you could beat us in. The situation's now reversed. NATO actually has greater conventional capacity than the Russians, but the Russians have developed greater tactical nuclear weapons. We have about 200 tactical nuclear weapons in the European theater, mostly stationed in the NATO countries bordering Russia. The Russians have 2,000, and their weapons are in depositories, or depots as they refer to them, stationed in Russia. They are devices that can be delivered by a variety of different, they can be a submarine launched missile, they can be a land launched missile, they can be landmines. There's a host of ways that tactical nuclear weapons can be delivered. So the Russians are in the position that we were in before. If this war were to expand to a conventional war between NATO and Russia, Russia would probably perceive that they're going to lose that war, just as we perceived that we would lose it back in the 50s and 60s, and that they need to escalate to nuclear weapons in order to win that war. I've also heard that it's an end on tactical nuclear weapons. If a tactical nuclear weapon is used, the area that it's used in would be uninhabitable for a long, long time. And which causes some analysts to say that's why Russia will never use them, because it will cause that area to be uninhabitable, but the radiation produced by the use of those weapons can blow in the wind, and it's going to blow towards Russia, just as Chernobyl did. So some people think the much more likely escalation might be cyber weapons. And I don't know exactly, I don't know too much about the capacity that either Russia or China has with respect to cyber weapons, but I will tell you, probably, God, it must have been 8 years ago, I was a member of a legal society. It's sort of an honorary society, and we were meeting out in Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh at a resort, and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Pittsburgh has responsibility for cyber warfare defense in the Justice Department. And the U.S. Attorney for Pittsburgh came to speak to us about cyber warfare and the risks and the dangers. And someone asked him, I've read these articles that say that the Chinese could shut down our electrical system if they wanted to, that they've got malware installed in our electrical system that would shut down our electrical system at the flip of a switch. Is that true? And he said, well, that involves classified information that I can't go into, but I will tell you generally that's what's being reported in the popular press about the risks of cyber war is pretty accurate. Now, I don't know what cyber capabilities Russia has. The one that scares me to death, and talk about it as a form of retaliation for economic sanctions, is malware in our financial system. I mean, imagine what would happen if none of us could access all of our accounts, and the banks couldn't, and the investment banks couldn't. I mean, the whole system were frozen, I mean, that would be, that's quite an economic retaliation. So, and as usual, now I'm sorry, I've gone on too long. Questions and comments.
Okay, the floor is open for questions and comments. Roger?
Dave, you've said a lot about escalation and cyber warfare and tactical nuclear, but if we stay with conventional, what possible, I think I already posed this question to you, but what could be a minor win that Putin could take away? Would we allow the Donbass region to be part of Russia if it would end the war? Would that be in our interest? I mean, that's an industrial section of, as I understand, of Ukraine. So that's a lot of the industry that Ukraine has, which for their GNP would probably be lost if Russia completely took that region. Have I got that understood correctly, do you think?
I'm not sure about where the industrial capacity, you're right, that's an industrialized area. And I'm not sure whether the industrial capacity is in the area that the Russians already sort of occupied through the separatist groups, or whether it's in the areas that Ukraine still occupies. I don't know. And I don't know the answer to your question. I don't know what the Biden administration would consider an acceptable resolution. I think they keep saying that what the resolution is to be determined by Ukraine and not by us. And I guess I hope that's true. Although the longer this war goes on, the greater the risk. In fact, you may be in. Avril Haines also told Congress that the longer the war goes on, there is always an enhanced potential for miscalculation, unintended escalation. The longer the war goes on, the greater the risk. And so I kind of wish that we were pressuring the Ukraine secretly to try to find a resolution. But I don't know that we are.
It's 8 o'clock.
And there's so much commentary now saying that we have to win, we have to have a victory in the Ukraine, that I'm not sure politically what Biden can do. One of my objectives for doing this class was because I feared that the typical rhetoric that gets thrown around during any war would create a political situation where the Biden administration would feel politically unable to reach a resolution that might otherwise be in our best interest. And just remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, to me, when you think about it, the Russians wanted us to withdraw missiles from their border that were in Turkey. We were going to withdraw the missiles anyway. The Russians didn't know it. And yet, Kennedy refused to make that commitment publicly because he was afraid of the political backlash, that he would be accused of having been soft on the Soviets or whatever. And he was prepared, and this is quite extraordinary to my mind, he was prepared to take the risk that he was being told was a thermonuclear risk, rather than reach a resolution that might be politically untenable. That is how powerful politics can be in these equations. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this class was to try to sensitize people, first of all, not to get swept away by all the rhetoric, and secondly, to appreciate the risks, so that if and when the Biden administration can find a way to resolve things, they aren't being criticized for being too soft.
Well, I think we should look at, I think Putin should look at our history and say, well, they lost in Vietnam, they stalemated in Korea, we lost in Afghanistan, and we stalemated in Iraq, and say, yeah, all right, get over it.
Yeah.
Putin, it's not so bad, right?
Well, and let me say, Russia stalemated in Georgia. They invaded Georgia, and then they've got now what they refer to as a frozen conflict. They stalemated in the Donbass after the 2014. So if you were to ask me, and I think you did, Roger, in an email,
Right.
what I think is the most probable outcome here, I hope the most probable outcome is that this thing is fought to a point where it's a stalemate, and either there's a formal agreement, or in my mind, more likely, a frozen conflict. And the shooting and the killing stops or becomes very sporadic, and things get de-escalated, and we live. It'll be a dangerous situation, but we'll live the next 20 years with a boundary through the Ukraine like we've got through Korea.
Yeah. Well, we've always talked about how difficult it is to get out of a war. It's easy to start one, and it's so difficult to end. And now that's what he certainly hasn't looked at history with that attitude.
Yeah. I mean, he should have. I mean, I could read you. No, I probably don't have it set aside, but I can read you one description of what the Biden administration was willing to do to try to avoid the war in the negotiations leading up to the invasion. If you're you want to hear this? Because I thought it was one of the questions that I've always wondered is, could this war have actually been avoided if we had said, okay, Putin, we'll give it to you in writing. We understand why you want it in writing, because at least you think we told you orally back in the 90s that NATO wouldn't expand. So now you want it in writing. All right, we'll put it in writing. We're not going to make Ukraine part of NATO. If that could have avoided this war, I'm not sure I understand why we didn't do it, because by saying that we're not going to defend NATO, that we're not going to extend mutual defense to the Ukraine, I mean, before the war even started. Remember, we said we're not putting our troops in there. We don't have any treaty obligation to Ukraine. Ukraine's not part of NATO. Ukraine's about to be invaded, or so we believe, by Russia, and we're telling everybody, hey, we're not getting involved. We're not going to fight. We're not going to treat your attack on Ukraine as an attack on us. Well, if we were saying that, then I don't understand why we wouldn't say, and we won't allow Ukraine to become part of NATO. The explanation I heard from one commentator was, I heard him questioned. He said, why wouldn't we make that commitment? He said, well, that would violate the sovereignty of Ukraine for us to say they can't be part of NATO. To which the questioner said, but wait a minute, they don't have any right to be part of NATO. In fact, any NATO country can veto another country becoming part of NATO. So how is that an interference with Ukrainian sovereignty? And then the guy said, well, it's the problem of this administration committing some future administration to committing some future administration. It might bind some future administration, to which it occurred to me, well, what the hell are we trying to do in Iran? I mean, didn't the Obama administration make a commitment in connection with the Iranian settlement that hopefully was going to bind Trump, but it didn't? So I'm not sure. So, but here's what they said. This is one commentator. In any case, a Russian leader more reasonable than Putin would not have demanded a legal document guaranteeing that Ukraine would never join NATO. Knowing that no such document could exist as a practical matter, he would have discerned the many reasons that membership wouldn't be offered, probably in his lifetime or beyond. Biden, in fact, publicly said as much. He also offered Putin transparency in military exercises in the region, on-site inspections of U.S. missile defense launchers in Poland and Romania to verify that they couldn't fire offensive cruise missiles, as Putin has charged they could, and a conference to reconsider 21st century European security with special attention to legitimate Russian interests. A less grandiose leader, especially one with an interest in building a more inclusive society and a more productive economy, neither of which has been a goal of Putin in his 22 years of rule, might have seen the political advantages to be gained from these confidence-building measures and a recognition of his grievances. So I think the Biden administration went a long way to try and give Putin the assurances that he claimed he needed. And I think at that point, Putin was just convinced that, I mean, remember, this is a fight that's been going on for 20 years between Ukraine, Russia, and the West. 20 years. And throughout that, there have been countless crises where Russia believes they were taken advantage of. And in some cases, I don't want to say they were taken advantage of, but their interests weren't really considered. And so I think that Putin just got to the point where I'm fed up. I can't rely on these people. You can't trust them to do anything they say. And I've got the military power that I can go in and I can topple this Ukrainian government in 5 days and put a puppet regime in place, and my problem is done. There was another solution that Putin actually tried to accomplish. You may have heard of the Minsk agreements. When Russia invaded, or when there was the separatist revolution in the Donbass and then Russia brought troops in to help it out, two agreements were reached between Ukraine and the separatists in Russia called Minsk I and Minsk II. Neither side has lived up to the agreements, but the Ukrainians haven't, because one of the agreements is that the Donbass, still part of Ukraine, would be given substantial powers in a federated government. One of the powers that the Donbass would be given was an ability to veto whether Ukraine would enter into NATO. And so Putin tried for about 8 years to get the Ukrainians to honor that federation commitment so that the Donbass would have control over whether Ukraine went into NATO, which would mean Russia could prevent the Ukraine from going into NATO. The Ukrainians said, well, we're not gonna do that federation stuff until you get Russian troops out of the Donbass. And the Russians said, well, we're not getting the Russian troops out of the Donbass until you honor the federation promise. So, I mean, this truly is a war that should have never happened. And God forbid, it will be worse than to me, World War I is the greatest tragedy in human history, because World War I not only killed 17 million people, but it laid the foundation for World War II, which killed another 40 million people. If this war were to evolve into World War III, it would truly be the most stupid thing that's ever happened and the most tragic thing that's ever happened in human history. That's why I'm so agitated about it.
Well, and in truth, World War II came about in large part because of how badly Germany felt treated at the end of World War I. And those grievances unaddressed, not dealt with in any meaningful way to find some resolution short of war, ultimately led to the rise of Hitler in World War II. And so you can see that the potential for that kind of pattern repeating itself.
Yeah, and I was just reminded in a book I was reading that Hitler would have never come to power if if two things hadn't happened. One, the Depression. Hitler was the Nazis sort of got up to about, I think, maybe 10% of the electorate in the early 20s, which is the period of time, you've seen those pictures of the Weimar Republic with people carrying money around in wheelbarrows.
Wheelbarrows of money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That wasn't during the Depression. That was during the early 20s.
After the war, right.
After World War I.
Okay.
And the Nazis got up to about 10%, and then there was a relatively prosperous period during the 20s. Nazis dropped down to like 4%. When the Depression hit, they shot up to 32, 33%. But even at that, they wouldn't have gotten the power except for the fact that German conservatives did what Republican conservatives are doing right now. They looked at Hitler and they said, this guy is a joke. Hitler. God, he's a joke. But he's got this big popular movement behind him. So we're going to make him chancellor in a government that we're going to control. And we're going to use Hitler to our own objectives, because as bad as Hitler is, the communists and the socialists, they're worse. So they did a deal with Hitler. Wrong choice. And it's
Which is
another
another whole series. So thank you, Dave, for doing this. I think it's been very enlightening, and I think you've accomplished your purpose, which is to get us to think a little more, perhaps dispassionately, a little more engaged in the context of historical realities and precedents. And one of the things that I think is often the consequence is the retrospective look back to say what might have happened, what could have prevented this. And if this helps us ask some of those questions in anticipation of some of the actions that might come, and moderates our thoughts and our dialogue and our discussion and the opinions we express, then certainly you will have achieved the goal that you set out to do. And we thank you for all of your preparation and all of the work that you did to put this together. It's been terrific.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for bearing with me. It's hard to shut me up. I tell people, you got to gag me or.
Sally, it seems to be laughing. I'm not sure why. Perhaps I'm wrong.
Well, no, I listened to a lot of this over coffee in the morning over the last couple of months, but it's overwhelming, but it's fascinating. And the context is really important.
Absolutely.
As you said.
Absolutely.
And Sally's ultimate defense is that she falls asleep when I start talking.
Well, no, if you do it past 6 o'clock at night. Yeah.
Oh. All right, then. Good night, Sally.
Thank you, Dave.
All right.
Thank you,
all
Dave.
for being here. Have a good
Thanks,
weekend.
Dave.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Wonderful, Dave.
Thanks, guys.
All right, we did it, honey.
Bye-bye.